Hey, Mike here. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Dark Poutine early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Welcome back to Dark Poutine. I am Mike Brown.
And this is Mathew.
Hello, Mathew.
Hi, Mike.
How are you?
I am good. It's part one of a two-parter that I wrote for us that was quite fraught for me.
Yeah, you were struggling with it because it has some personal feelings that go along with it.
Absolutely. It's the Gay Purge, the purge of my people in my own country. The whole thing about these next two episodes, I just kept on stopping and thinking, but this is Canada.
Stories like these are the reason this podcast exists.
The views, information, and opinions expressed during the Dark Poutine podcast are solely those of the producer and do not necessarily represent those of Curious Cast, its affiliate, Global News, nor their parent company, Chorus Entertainment.
Dark Poutine is not for the faint of heart or squeamish. Listener discretion is strongly advised. We're not experts on the topics we present, nor are we journalists. We're two ordinary Canadian schmucks chatting about crime and the dark side of history. Let's get to it. Put on your toque, grab yourself a double-double and a Nanaimo bar. It's time to scarf down some Dark Poutine.
You are responsible for obtaining and maintaining at your own cost all equipment needed to listen to Dark Poutine. Dark Poutine can be addictive. Side effects may include, but not be limited to, pausing and questioning the system, elevated heart rate, pondering humanity, odd looks from colleagues as you laugh out loud at work, family members not into true crime worrying about you. Positive side effects may include some perspectives and opinions that you disagree with, as well as some wokeness and empathy. If you don't think Dark Poutine is for you, consult your doctor immediately.
So today, thanks to Mathew's intrepid and unflinching research, I added that, we're peeling back the layers on one of the most harrowing chapters in Canadian history, the Gay Purge. Officially, the campaign targeted LGBTQ+ individuals as part of a national security effort, citing their supposed susceptibility to blackmail by Soviet agents. But the real story is that these purges were driven by more institutional homophobia cloaked in Cold War fears and rhetoric than by legitimate security concerns. The blackmail excuse became a convenient cover for the government's systemic discrimination, allowing a deeply entrenched homophobia to flourish unchecked. This campaign stretched from the 1940s all the way through to the 1990s, destroying lives, careers, and communities along the way. We'll explore the origins of this agenda, how it escalated, and how the fruit machine emerged as part of this cruel campaign. This is Dark Poutine episode 347, The Gay Purge in Canada, Part 1, the 1940s through the 1960s. The end of World War II ushered in the Cold War, a period of tension between the Western world and the Soviet Union. Governments across the West, including Canada, were gripped by fear that communist spies were infiltrating their ranks. This is most commonly called the Red Scare. In this climate of distrust, any perceived weakness could be weaponized. The late 1940s to the mid-1950s saw McCarthyism, named after U.S. Senator Joe McCarthy, in full force in the USA, where anyone who was a left-wing activist, including academics, intellectuals, labor union members, artists, and writers, were investigated, forced out of their jobs, or jailed. McCarthy and his acolytes were bent on finding the enemy within. One lesser-known, or at least lesser-discussed, oppressive agenda in the United States occurred at the same time and was known as the Lavender Scare. so named after U.S. Senator Everett Dirksen, who repeatedly used the term lavender lads in reference to gay men. In 1952, Dirksen said that a Republican victory would mean the removal of all lavender lads from the State Department. From that point on, gays and lesbians were actively sought out and hounded out of the U.S. military. As Canada and the U.S. were close allies who shared military intelligence, the U.S. pressure on Canada to deal with gay military or intelligence employees was explicit. The Americans had officially declared homosexuals as security risks, with CIA Director Roscoe Hillenkotter claiming that the, quote, moral pervert is a security risk of so serious a nature that he must be weeded out of government employment wherever he is found, end quote. To say that the Americans forced Canada to do it would be an overstatement. Canada's security panel was highly sensitive to American security concerns. We all know that old expression, if the USA sneezes, Canada gets a cold. But the gay purge here wasn't just a symptom of an American disease. It was not an isolated incident, but was part of a long history of gay hate and a growing trend toward moral policing across Canada. As early as 1948, the Criminal Code was revised to introduce the label of, quote, criminal sexual psychopath, a category disproportionately used to target gay men. The law was eventually extended to include women as well.
Prior to that, of course, it was already illegal to be gay in Canada.
Okay, yeah.
But in 1948, those in power thought they could add the word psychopath, just for shits and giggles.
Sure, yeah, let's call it, call these people crazy because they love somebody who has the same bits as them.
It's so ridiculous.
What?
It's such madness.
And it's not like homosexuality is a recent invention.
Gays have always existed.
Yeah.
It's as natural as being straight.
From the Canadian Encyclopedia's article, Canada's Cold War Purge of 2S LGBTQ 2+ from Public Service, written by Ron Levy, October 3, 2018. Quote, at the time, people who engaged in same-sex relations were widely considered to be mentally ill and a menace to society. The law targeted sex between men, making it a criminal offense. It also made any activity that could potentially lead to sexual relations between two men illegal. In 1953, the law was extended to women. Thus, men or women who sought out opportunities to socialize together, for example by dancing, congregating in a bar, or even attending private house parties, risked arrest. Human rights laws did not protect against discrimination based on sexual orientation. That made it perfectly legal to fire someone from their job due to sexuality. End quote. By 1950, the RCMP had created a specialized unit to monitor people suspected of homosexuality in the public service and the military. So fact is, while there was pressure from the U.S. in 1952, the seeds of this sentiment found an already fertile ground in Canada. The Cold War paranoia over communist infiltration provided the perfect pretext for Canada to escalate its existing campaign of moral policing, enthusiastically advancing the narrative that gay men and women, by nature of their secrecy, were potential security threats and covert operatives. Historian Gary Kinsman explains in the book The Canadian War on Queers, quote, homosexuals were seen as easily blackmailed because of their hidden sexual identities. They were thought to be morally compromised and therefore more likely to be coerced into working for Soviet spies, end quote. The mainstream media helped spread this fear. For example, the Globe and Mail ran an article in 1955 which stated, quote, exposure, not punishment, is what the normal homosexual, if we can say any homosexual is normal, fears. Oh God, Mathew, you're making me say horrible things. This is why homosexuals are found to be in danger if placed in positions where important government secrets may reside. Good Lord.
I know. But Kinsman, the Canadian War on Queers is fantastic. But Kinsman points out throughout his book that this blackmail narrative doesn't stand up to scrutiny at all, and it never really did. that it wasn't about national security. The government already had countless employees working quietly, competently, and loyally in various positions who were known to be gay.
Yeah.
And there was never any evidence that they posed a greater security risk than anyone else.
It's just another way for homophobes to be homophobic.
Of course it is.
Yeah. And it's like, oh, look. But I mean, like, really, you can find something to blackmail everybody on, and I don't care who you are.
The screwy thing, though, Mike, is this was back when in society it was so homophobic that it created the opportunity for blackmail as well.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody ever tried to blackmail me for being gay, they just can't because I'm like out and happy.
Out and proud.
Right?
In 1952, Canada amended the Immigration Act to bar all homosexuals from entering the country, both as immigrants and visitors. Canada also issued a new directive that categorized defects of character, which included homosexuality, as grounds for dismissal from public service, not just military, but any public service job. So if you were a janitor in a public service job, you could be let go because you were gay. That year, one of the earliest firings in Canada occurred when a man working at Canada's communications branch, which was responsible for intercepting Soviet radio signals, was found to be gay. Although his loyalty and competence were never questioned, his homosexuality was seen as a security risk due to the fears that the U.S. would cease sharing intelligence with Canada unless they cracked down on security risks like gay individuals. This case set the stage for a much broader purge across government agencies here in Canada and in our outposts abroad. The purge had a huge toll on primarily gay men at first who worked for the Canadian government. Careers were destroyed, mental and physical health was smashed, and lives were lost. Author Gary Kinsman said it so well, quote, "Imagine, if you will, being told that the very country you would willingly lay down your life to defend doesn't want you, doesn't accept you, sees you as defective, sees you as a threat to our national security, not because you can't do the job or because you lack patriotism or courage, no, because of who you are as a person and because of who your sexual partners are." End quote. While thousands of lives were disrupted or destroyed by the purge, many of those stories remain untold. Ordinary people who, after enduring unimaginable hardships, simply wanted to move on and leave the trauma behind. However, a few cases stand out. Stories of prominent individuals whose positions and contributions made their downfall more tragic. Some of these names you may recognize if you're familiar with Canada's diplomatic legacy. Their stories offer not just a glimpse into the toll of systemic discrimination, but also reveal how Cold War paranoia and moral policing reshaped their careers and ultimately their lives. The first is Egerton Herbert Norman, who went by Herbert. In our research, we couldn't find any confirmation by Norton himself that he was gay or any ex-partners who would come forward to confirm it. The general assumption now is that he probably was. But isn't this the whole point? Was he gay? Was he not gay? What does it matter? It didn't. But to the RCMP, the American and Canadian governments, it mattered a lot. Born in 1909 to Canadian Methodist missionary parents in Karuizawa, Japan, Norman spent most of his childhood immersed in Japanese culture. His early exposure to Japan would profoundly shape both his worldview and his career in Canada's diplomatic corps. In the 1930s, Norman pursued higher education at the University of Toronto, Cambridge, and Harvard, where he completed a PhD. During his young student years, he was involved in many clubs, debating teams, and discussion groups. In Cambridge, he had briefly been in the company of the university's communist discussion group at one of their meetings. After university, he became a dedicated civil servant and diplomat. He had been an interpreter at the Canadian Embassy in Japan when the war broke out and later became the head of the Canadian mission to occupied Japan after the war. An expert in Japanese history and culture, he was seconded to the U.S. Intelligence Corps, where he sometimes disagreed with the politics of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, General Douglas MacArthur.
Wouldn't it be cool to be an expert in Japanese history and culture?
I love Japanese history and culture. I've always really enjoyed that culture. I just last night watched a Takashi Miike film about samurai, so that was kind of fun.
Awesome. And I'm thinking about learning how to do that Japanese rope tying.
Rope tying with friends, you mean shibari?
Yeah, shibari looks really cool. More for the art of it than anything else.
Sure. So people are going to have to look up shibari, and some people will be shocked.
If you know, you know.
Yep, exactly. Anyway, back to Herbert Norman. One of MacArthur's people was worried that there was a serious diversion of opinion on keeping Japan under strong U.S. control, a diversion that, quote, should be corrected as soon as possible. This put Norman, who saw benefits in some socialist policies, in the crosshairs of the Americans who called him a homosexual and a communist. In the early 1950s, the RCMP investigated Norman as part of the Purge, interrogated him about his sexuality and whether or not he had communist affiliations, despite no evidence of either. He was cleared at the time. The Americans would not give up on the pressure they put on Canada, however, so Norman was recalled, demoted, and sent to New Zealand to get him out of the limelight. The problem with Norman, however, was he was just so damn brilliant as a person and as a diplomat. This was an incredible man. He returned to center stage in 1956 as Canada's ambassador to Egypt when he played a crucial role in the Suez Crisis. Norman's diplomatic skill was on full display during the crisis, where he successfully convinced Egyptian President Nasser to allow UN peacekeepers, including Canadian troops, onto Egyptian soil. This intervention was hailed as a diplomatic triumph, positioning Canada as a global peacekeeping leader. Despite his success in 1957, a U.S. Senate committee once again named him as a communist sympathizer. Devastated by the public allegations and the strain of continuous scrutiny on his private life, Norman died by suicide on April 4, 1957, jumping from a building in Cairo. Alistair Stewart, then a member of Parliament for Winnipeg North, said about his death, quote, I believe that Mr. Norman was murdered by slander. I believe that he died as surely as if someone had put a knife into his back, end quote. In his own words from one of the many suicide notes he left for people, Norman talked about the smear campaign against him and how it led to his suicide. Quote, You can't wash off the poison of a smear from your emotions. How can you fight back against this sort of thing? End quote. In 1990, an independent report commissioned by Canada's Department of External Affairs confirmed that there was, quote, not one iota of evidence to suggest that Norman had ever been a spy or had compromised Canada's interests. The report, authored by Peyton V. Lyon, aimed to clear Norman's name once and for all, acknowledging that the accusations against him were unfounded and rooted in Cold War paranoia. Historian Roger Bowen echoed this sentiment in his book, Innocence is Not Enough, The Life and Death of Herbert Norman, emphasizing that, quote, Norman's downfall was the result of a political climate that could not tolerate perceived deviation, no matter how unfounded the suspicion, end quote.
Norman's life really remains a cautionary tale. I hate that term, but I'm going to use it, about the destructive power of fear and suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
His contributions to diplomacy, particularly his work in post-war Japan and during the Suez Crisis, that's what endures and is a testament to how brilliant this guy was.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it so much more tragic that these harsh realities of political loyalty in Canada was measured through fear and innuendo. It just destroyed him.
Yeah.
It's just so bad.
Our next prominent victim of the Gay Purge is none other than John Wendell Holmes, a prominent Canadian diplomat and a gay man. In his role as a diplomat, John Holmes was an international relations scholar and public servant whose career spanned decades. Holmes joined the Department of External Affairs in 1943, a position that would see him serve in various diplomatic roles across the world, including postings in Moscow and New York. He was notably involved in representing Canada in international forums during the formative years of post-war diplomacy. Holmes made significant contributions to Canada's foreign policy during the Cold War. One of his most critical roles was as Canada's envoy to the United Nations in the 1940s and 50s. In this capacity, he was involved in the foundation of the post-war international order and helped shape Canada's role in global diplomacy. As a senior diplomat, he worked on key issues relating to peacekeeping and the promotion of human rights. Holmes became the head of the Canadian Institute of International Affairs, CIA, a think tank focused on Canada's role in global affairs. He was a pivotal voice in shaping how Canada positioned itself as a middle power during the Cold War, advocating for peace, diplomacy, and conflict resolution through international cooperation. Holmes also played a key role in fostering academic and debates on foreign policy, international security, and Canada's evolving role in multilateral organizations like the UN and NATO. After years of this distinguished service, his career was ended in November of 1959. He was hauled out of his home late at night by RCMP officers and brought to their headquarters where he was interrogated for hours, with no lawyer and no support, a tactic used to isolate and wear down a suspect. During the interrogation, he was intensely questioned about his private life and his relationships. The focus was primarily about whether he was gay or not. The RCMP had no evidence that he was a spy, and there was no tip-off given to them by others that he may be compromised. They were interrogating him about being gay. He admitted that he was, and then when asked if he had any connections to Soviet agents, he denied it. Despite his honesty, or perhaps because of it, the RCMP labeled his sexual orientation as a, quote, character defect, and officially labeled him unfit for service and a potential security risk. The emotional toll of the interrogation and the aftermath was severe. Within weeks, Holmes suffered a nervous breakdown and checked himself into a hospital in Woodstock, Ontario. His career in the Department of External Affairs, where he had held prominent roles, was effectively over. Although he had an incredible reputation as a diplomat, he was forced to resign, illustrating the deeply institutional nature of the purge. In later years, showing great resilience, strength, and his deep dedication to Canada as a public servant, Holmes went on to teach at York University and the University of Toronto, mentoring a generation of scholars and policymakers. His legacy includes extensive writings on Canadian foreign policy, including works like Life with Uncle, The Canadian-American Relationship, 1981, which critiqued the complexities of Canada's relationship with our powerful southern neighbor, the U.S. His published works are considered essential guides to the history of Canadian foreign policy.
Yeah, and he later reflected on his experiences later in life, and he said, it was not my loyalty that was ever in question, but the prejudice of the time dictated that I could not continue to serve.
Yeah, gross.
But somebody who's so dedicated to this country, right? And that's the thing about these people. These people were dedicated to the country. They worked for us and they cared and they loved the country, and then the country did this to them.
By the late 1950s, as the Cold War heated up, so did the discrimination against the LGBTQ+ community. They were painted as not just morally suspect, but full-blown security threats. The RCMP had a particular focus on the Department of External Affairs and its embassies around the world, as, from a paper called Analysis of the Anti-Homosexual Security Campaign in Canadian Civil Service, written by Gary Kinsman, states, quote, members of the far right saw them as a notorious cesspool of homosexuals and perverts, end quote. This view was partly due to a policy by the Department of External Affairs to post bachelors to the Soviet Union's bloc of nations because the positions were thought to be too challenging for married men with families. Having targeted and ruined the career of John Wendell Holmes, they now went after another prominent Canadian ambassador. This diplomat wasn't as lucky, if we can even call it that, as he didn't even survive interrogation at the hands of the RCMP. His name was John Benjamin Clark Watkins. John Watkins, born on December 3, 1902 in Norval, now Halton Hills, Ontario, was a scholar and diplomat who served as Canada's ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1954 to 1956. One of his key achievements was organizing a historic 1955 meeting between Canadian PM Lester B. Pearson and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Watkins studied languages and history at the University of Toronto, earning his master's degree in 1927. Later, he pursued further studies at Columbia and earned a Ph.D. from Cornell University. Early in his career, Watkins worked with the American Scandinavian Foundation, promoting cultural exchange between North America and Nordic countries. He also taught at Queen's University, Guelph Agricultural College, and the University of Manitoba during World War II. Watkins joined the Department of External Affairs in 1946 and quickly rose through the ranks. His knowledge of Russian earned him a post in Moscow in 1948, where he soon became fluent. After stints in Norway and other diplomatic roles, Watkins returned to Moscow as an ambassador from 1954 to 56. Afterward, he held high-level positions including Assistant Undersecretary of State for External Affairs before serving as ambassador to Denmark. In 1964, the RCMP targeted him as part of the purge, as authorities suspected him of having relationships with men. Like Holmes, he was hauled out of his residence and detained. But unlike Holmes, the interrogation didn't last one night. It went on for 27 days. 27 days of being interrogated about his sexuality. Let's call it what it was. Sustained psychological, if not physical, torture. During the ordeal at the hands of RCMP, he suffered a heart attack and died on Monday, the 12th of October, 1964. The circumstances of his death were kept secret until 1980 when the Quebec government, Watkins' torture and death occurred in Montreal, ordered an inquest into his death. The RCMP did not release much detail about the interrogation, citing, quote, concerns over national security, but simply admitted that he died during questioning, and they've since concluded that he had remained loyal to Canada and was never a spy.
Yeah, and you're going to see in part 2 as well, the RCMP. The RCMP does not come out well in these 2 episodes. I'm going to tell you that much.
The RCMP doesn't come out looking stellar in a lot of historical things.
Yeah, they just don't. And, even after his death, though, Watkins continues to be a public servant of Canada. Do you want to know how, Mike?
How?
The JBC Watkins Awards are bestowed by the Canada Council for the Arts in 2 categories, music and theatre, and architecture. So this award was endowed by the estate of Watkins. So despite all of this, despite everything he went through, despite his horrible death, he's still serving Canada in his death.
There you go. That's kind of cool. And we will be back after this quick break. And we are back. Mathew, thoughts on your script?
Yeah, it's, those are 3 high-profile cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just incredible men that were torn apart by the government, the RCMP. But honestly, Mike, I could have written an episode on each one of them. But this is a 50-year purge that went much further and much, much deeper into the civil service and society. Much deeper than high-ranking officials.
Well, let's get into it then. The RCMP and governmental surveillance campaign expanded far beyond a handful of well-known figures. The RCMP ramped up its operations determined to protect the nation from what it perceived as a threat lurking in the public service and society at large. By 1960, the campaign had grown to an alarming scale. As the Canadian Encyclopedia notes, the RCMP was, quote, annually uncovering hundreds of confirmed, alleged, and suspected 2S LGBTQ2+ individuals in government departments and agencies, end quote. These included not only high security offices, but also low-level organizations like the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the Department of Public Works, and the Unemployment Insurance Commission. No role was too minor to escape the RCMP's attention. The efforts to identify and eliminate gay individuals weren't confined to public servants. As part of their strategy, the RCMP collaborated with local police agencies across the country, expanding their reach far beyond federal employees. It's estimated that over 9,000 Canadian citizens, only about one-third of whom were public servants, ended up on the RCMP's list and were placed under surveillance. To be clear, the RCMP, along with local police, weren't just surveilling those working within government agencies. They were actively interrogating and monitoring private citizens, intruding into people's personal lives in search of anyone who might fit their profile of perceived, quote, deviance. These efforts created an environment of fear and suspicion that extended well beyond the walls of government buildings and into gay communities across the nation.
Just think about that, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
The RCMP and the police start trying to root out who's gay in communities across the country.
Right.
Like, what the hell country is this?
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about the RCMP when you were talking about them earlier, and police. But they are kind of a bellwether. They are, how can I put it? They essentially are enforcing the will of the masses at the time. So I'm not absolving them of not being more forward thinking, but they're just there to exist, to move whatever laws or ways of thought or shitty agenda, sort of the prevailing way of thought in the country at the time.
Yeah, I mean, but you're going to find out in part 2 of this that even when society started changing and homosexuality was decriminalized, the RCMP doubled down as a law unto themselves. Interesting.
We've seen that a number of times with that organization as well. Take a look at the debacle that was the massacre in Nova Scotia.
And for our U.S. listeners, the RCMP is essentially the FBI.
Yeah, it's our FBI.
So essentially, imagine the FBI not being told by the government to do it, but to continue on and decide you're going to just keep going after gays.
And the interesting thing about the RCMP, in contrast to the FBI, is the FBI doesn't do local policing. So the RCMP are tasked with federal things, and then do local policing as well, even pulling people over on the highway.
Yeah, so imagine the FBI going all the way down to being your local beat cop.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
That's scary.
One thing we haven't yet discussed is how the RCMP went about trying to identify who was gay. They employed extensive surveillance tactics as part of their efforts to purge gay individuals from public service, military roles, and other government institutions. Their operations eventually expanded to creating files on private citizens far beyond traditional policing methods and relied heavily on covert surveillance, sting operations, and manipulation. The RCMP's surveillance began outside bars, parks, and other gathering spots. They stationed officers outside known gay bars and hotels, discreetly photographing anyone entering or leaving these locations. Their goal was to track suspected gay individuals, compile detailed files, and add names to a growing list of suspected persons. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time was enough to put you under suspicion. Once your name was on their list, an RCMP visit to your home or workplace was almost inevitable.
Stop and listen to what we're saying.
Yeah.
Just because you're gay, the RCMP are knocking on your door.
Yep.
Knock, knock, knock. Your life is about to be ruined.
Once the RCMP initiated contact with someone on their list, the interrogations that followed were invasive and often brutal. One former public servant, Robert Laxton, shared his experiences with the RCMP's intimidation tactics in an article for Arthur newspaper. Quote, They brought me into a room and started asking me all these personal questions about my relationships, my private life. They had photos of me going into a bar, but they wanted names. They wanted me to tell them who else was gay. I refused, and they threatened to ruin my career. I felt trapped. I knew they could destroy everything I worked for." End quote. This kind of manipulation was commonplace. The RCMP pressured individuals not just to confess, but to implicate others, spreading fear throughout the community. Once you were under suspicion, it was difficult, if not impossible, to escape the RCMP's web. As the RCMP's campaign intensified, they moved their operations inside gay bars. Officers infiltrated these spaces, posing as patrons, while hidden cameras documented the movements and interactions of those present. An anonymous source interviewed for the Canadian Encyclopedia recounted, quote, "We even knew occasionally that there was somebody in some police force. You'd see someone with a newspaper held up, and if you look closely, you could see a camera behind it photographing everyone in the bar." End quote. The Lord Elgin Hotel's basement bar in Ottawa was one of the focal points of these operations. It attracted many public servants and military personnel, making it a high-priority target for RCMP surveillance. Over time, however, the community grew wise to the RCMP's presence. If someone noticed a camera or suspected an officer in a bar, they would alert others, demonstrating how the gay community had begun to protect itself against these invasive tactics. The RCMP's reach extended beyond bars and hotels into public parks where officers posed as gay men to entrap individuals seeking same-sex encounters. These sting operations were designed to catch people in compromising situations and pressure them into cooperating with the authorities. Informants were another key component of the RCMP's strategy. Many of these informants were coerced or blackmailed into providing names of other LGBTQ+ individuals, further spreading fear within the community. However, over time, the RCMP's reliance on informants became less effective. Members of the community, especially those in lower-ranking civil service roles, began refusing to cooperate. The shifting social climate, marked by a slow but growing acceptance of gay individuals, emboldened many to stand their ground. During interrogations, some individuals responded defiantly, challenging officers to prove it. As resistance in the gay community grew, the RCMP became increasingly desperate to maintain control. Their traditional methods, intimidation, surveillance, and informants, were no longer yielding the results they once had. The RCMP needed a new way to identify and expose gay individuals without relying on human informants. This desperation led to the search for a so-called scientific solution. They wanted a de facto technological way to prove that someone was gay. Enter the fruit machine. The fruit machine was a controversial device employed by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police during the mid-20th century during what we're calling the Gay Purge. The fruit machine purportedly measured sexual orientation by analyzing subjects' physiological responses to sexually explicit images. The fruit machine proved to be just as flawed and damaging as the RCMP's earlier tactics. It left a lasting legacy of fear and trauma in its wake. More on the fruit machine and the Canadian Gay Purge in our next episode. And that's it for Dark Poutine episode 347, The Gay Purge, Part 1, the 1940s to the 1960s.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the fruit machine, and in fact, we're going to talk post-fruit machine as well. And I have the RCMP just doubled down again and again and again. Right up to the 90s, Mike.
Right up to the 90s. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. Well, I mean, we even see issues with policing around gay people into the 2000s with the stuff that went on with Bruce MacArthur in Toronto.
A lot of people, some people in the gay community get upset at others when they don't want the police marching, right?
Right.
But, and I can see why.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The cops did us no favors for decades and decades and decades.
Right.
That's right. It's time for voicemails. You can leave us a message at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you. Let's see who called us this week.
Okie doke. So here's our first voicemail for the week.
Hey, Mike and Matt. It's Matt, actually, from Calgary. 3:30 in the morning. Something that's been on my mind, and I'm having some trouble finding the Younger Yard on Facebook. But there's something that happened back in 1993 in Winnipeg, and I'm wondering if maybe you'd be interested in covering it. It was the murder of a classmate and her mother, I think by the mother's boyfriend. Winnipeg, 1993, in West Kildonan. If you want to take a look at it, I'm still trying to find some more information, but I'll call again. And thank you for all that you do. I have been listening to you for now since the beginning. So take care. Cheers.
Well, thank you for that. Make sure that you send me an email, darkpoutinepodcast@gmail.com, with the people's names. And that way I can really dig into this for you, because it sounds fascinating. And I'm really curious when somebody says they have a connection to a crime, especially a story that we haven't told yet, because I'll reach out to you and you can tell me stuff about that person, that you remember those people and all that kind of stuff. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Because having that connection and being able to hear a story from somebody who knew the people is always helpful.
Exactly.
So should we give Matt a job?
Yeah, give Matt a job. So it's something that keeps him up at night, I guess.
Yeah, so he said his name is Matt Actually. So
okay, Matt Actually.
I've never heard a last
Sounds
name.
like a drag queen, maybe.
Matt Actually, no. So he's up all night, so I'm thinking maybe he's an astronomer.
Oh, interesting, an astronomer.
Yeah.
So he's up at 3:30, he's waiting for the clouds to part so he can perhaps look at some wonderful...
Does it get cloudy in Calgary? I always thought it was bright, clear skies in Calgary.
Well, it does get overcast from time to time, Matthew.
Most of the times that I've been, usually when I'm in Alberta, it's just a big old sky.
I've been in Alberta when it's overcast. I've been when there's big old sky, and I've been there when there's smoke as well, and you can't see a darn thing.
That's true. I like Calgary. Calgary is a good city.
Yeah, Calgary's great. Edmonton is great. I need to get more out into the prairies. Like I have spent no time in Saskatoon, for example. A little bit of time in Regina, and
is Calgary the prairies?
Absolutely, it is. Yeah,
I don't think it is the prairies. I think the prairies starting in Saskatchewan.
Well, it's a prairie province. Alberta is.
No, it's cows and oil. And and mountains and some flat land, but it's not as flat as it is not as prairie as Manitoba and Saskatchewan.
Oh God, Albertans who are prairie folk, please don't call with hate. Anyway.
I don't think of it as prairies. I think of it as this. Okay, this is going to sound weird. I think of it as farmland, not prairies.
Oh. Okay.
I don't know. It's just in my head. I mean, I know there are prairies there, but I just think of it as a bit more, Saskatchewan's almost all prairies, right? And Alberta is like a lot more things,
Alberta is more diverse in landscape for sure. Yeah. Roar, Steve, roar.
Steve, he needs to go outside.
He needs to go outside. Does he need a pee or a poo?
Yep.
Okay. That's it for this week's voicemails. Again, you can leave us one at 1-877-327-5786 or 1-877-DARK-PTN. We'd love to hear from you, even if it is just to say hi and to tell us to go shit in our hats. If you're stumped for what to chat with us about, a quick story is welcome. We have one Donut Money donor and one patron this week. And guess what? They're both the same person.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so Mark Simas, who we missed out, he's been a patron since May. He messaged me to say, hey, you guys missed me. And I'm oh no, I felt terrible. I really do feel terrible when we miss somebody. So if you're a paying patron, let us know.
If we missed you, Mike has poor organizational skills if you were missed.
I don't have attention to detail on my resume for a reason.
I thought you were going to fight me on that, but you're self-aware on this point.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Absolutely. I know I'm a disorganized fool. There's no question. But I guess I'm a creative, right? And that's kind of my excuse.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so Mark says that as far as donut money goes, he says for you guys to grab some donuts, pasties, donata, happy holidays. Well, thank you, Mark. And I know where he's from, Mathew.
Where is he from?
He is from...
Hold on. Justin, can you take Steve out? You can leave that in if you want to.
Okay.
Steve needs to go, and Justin's ignoring his calls of needing to pee.
Okay.
Where's he from?
So Mark Simas is from Cambridge, Ontario.
Oh,
Not
Cambridge
in UK, but Cambridge, Ontario. Is Cambridge in Ontario as fancy as Cambridge in the UK?
Absolutely not. But that being said, I actually really like the city. It's just past Strathroy, my hometown, actually. It's sort of, if you go on one highway, it's sort of the next big place. It's in the middle of southwestern Ontario with lots of farmland, not prairies. But yeah, no, Cambridge is a good place.
So what do you think Mark does there in Cambridge, Ontario, Mathew?
I think he owns a nightclub.
He owns a nightclub?
Yeah.
Okay.
A discotheque.
The discotheque.
Yeah, he owns a local discotheque in
What's
Cambridge.
the name of the discotheque?
Rumors.
Rumors, of course. There's always a place called Rumors.
Always a case. It's
city.
usually a gay bar.
Usually a gay bar. A gay bar. A gay bar.
I'm gonna take you to a gay bar.
I'm
gonna put something in ya.
Oh no.
Remember that song?
Yes, I absolutely do. Anyway. Thanks to all our patrons and Donut Money donors, past and present, for your generosity. It helps to keep the show going. You can become a patron of Dark Poutine at patreon.com/darkpoutine. For a one-time donation, you can send us donut money via PayPal or interact using our email address, darkpoutinepodcast@gmail.com. If you don't already subscribe to the show, it would mean a lot if you did. You can easily find Dark Poutine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. If you haven't gotten yours yet, my 2 books are available to order via links on the Dark Poutine website or anywhere fine books are sold. And speaking of darkpoutine.com, check it out for show notes and other cool stuff. We'd appreciate it if you gave Dark Poutine a like or a follow on Facebook and Instagram. Most importantly, thank you for listening. Tell your friends about us. Word of mouth is a powerful thing. Steve's about to crap his pants, so Mathew has to go and take him outside. So thank you to everybody for listening and for being a part of the Dark Poutine community, and we'll be back next week with part 2. So until next time, don't forget to be a good egg and not a bad apple. Bye-bye.
I'm taking Steve out now. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye.